I served 5 years in the military. I've had a little experience. I've spent a little bit of time over in the Pakistan, Afghanistan area, as well as in Iran. But I wouldn't wait for my generals. I'm the commander-in-chief. I make the decisions. I tell the generals what to do, and I'd bring them home as quickly as possible, and I'd get them out of Iraq as well, and I wouldn't start a war in Libya. I'd quit bombing Yemen, and I'd quit bombing Pakistan. I'd start taking care of people here at home because we could save hundreds of billions of dollars. Our national security is not enhanced by our presence over there. We have no purpose there. We should learn the lessons of history, and the longer we're there, the worse things are, and the more danger we're in as well, because our presence there is not making friends, let me tell you.
In 2016, Rand Paul announced his candidacy for President of the United States.
I have a message that is loud and clear and does not mince words. We have come to take our country back.
Much like his father, there was something radically different about Rand Paul from all of his Republican running mates.
Paul, let me ask you, you heard Governor Kasich say Assad must go. Do you agree?
No, I think it's a huge mistake. I think regime change in Syria, and this is what I've been saying this for several years now. In 2013, when we first went in, I said, you're going to give arms to the allies of al-Qaeda, to radical jihadists? That's crazy.
Governor Christie recently said, quote, if you're getting high in Colorado today, where marijuana has been legalized, enjoy it until January 2017, because I will enforce the federal laws against marijuana.
The bottom line is the states, we say we like the 10th Amendment until we start talking about this. And I think the federal government's gone too far. I think that the war on drugs has had a racial outcome and really has been something that's really damaged our inner cities. The Fourth Amendment was what we fought the revolution over. John Adams said it was the spark that led to our war for independence. And I'm proud of standing for the Bill of Rights, and I will continue to stand for the Bill of Rights.
Two freshman senators, a political odd couple, Democrat Cory Booker of New Jersey and Republican Rand Paul of Kentucky, have introduced legislation called the REDEEM Act that would make it easier for juveniles who commit nonviolent crimes to expunge or seal those convictions from their records.
Let's talk about your campaign. You have been reaching out to black voters, to millennials. You have said that the 1.1 million immigrants in this country already here should have some legal status and pay taxes. If I didn't know better, and I do know better, I would think you might be a Democrat.
We've got a lot of problems with criminal justice. Most of it stems from the war on drugs, though.
Well, I admire you for that position.
Though fiscally, he had maybe the most conservative views out of everybody running, what was special about him was his obvious detachment from his colleagues on foreign policy, criminal justice, and protecting our constitutional rights.
So here's Rand Paul. Here's what he says. Now, this is the one and only sane thing you're going to hear all night. Ready? Here it is.
The question is, how do we keep America safe from terrorism? Trump says we ought to close that internet thing. The question really is, what does he mean by that? Like they do in North Korea? Like they do in China?
What was also refreshing was how he could think outside the box and not bend to the dogma of the Republican Party. It was interesting how much he was admired by left-wing commentators.
We do not fear them. I think if we ban certain religions, if we censor the internet, I think that at that point the terrorists will have won.
Democrats weren't the only people who were mad at Rand Paul for his filibuster. Some Republicans were mad. And you know we're on the right side when the Republican and the Democratic establishment are opposed to us.
My guest tonight, United States Senator representing the great state of Kentucky. His new book is called Taking a Stand, Moving Beyond Partisan Politics to Unite America. That's likely. Please welcome back to the program, Senator Rand Paul. Sir!
He was so obviously sane and genuine compared to everybody else running in the Republican Party.
If you want boots on the ground and you want them to be our sons and daughters, you got 14 other choices. There will always be a Bush or Clinton.
Even though he was calling for extreme conservative reform on taxes and spending, He was hated by many in his own party. They would go so far as to say that he was a threat to our national security and that he didn't deserve to be in the Republican Party.
You have said that Senator Paul's opposition to the NSA's collection of phone records has made the United States weaker and more vulnerable, even going so far as to say that he should be called before Congress to answer for it if we should be hit by another terrorist attack.
Those who believe we can disengage from the world at large and be safe by leading from behind, vote for someone else.
But if a libertarian like him becomes the leader of the Republican Party, gets a nomination, will you vote for him?
Well, first off, I don't think that will happen because the Republican Party is not a libertarian party. It is a conservative party, and it will nominate a conservative, not a libertarian.
I'd like to also go back to, though, another question, which is Donald Trump a serious candidate? The reason I ask this is if you're going to close the internet...
Rand Paul should have been the prominent outsider voice that dominated the stage, but somehow he was outflanked by this moron.
They can kill us, but we can't kill them. That's what you're saying. And
Donald Trump successfully hijacked the Republican nomination by harnessing the enraged and disenfranchised inside the party. It was enough to completely flatten any attempts by Rand Paul to gain outsider credibility.
Donald Trump is now officially the Republican presidential nominee.
To win an election in the United States, a candidate needs prominent media coverage. Donald Trump was a genius when it came to this concept and received more airtime than any other Republican running. Rand Paul was virtually ignored, heavily smeared, and completely dismissed as a viable option.
When ISIS formed in this vacuum created by Barack Obama and Secretary
With Donald Trump leading the charge for the Republicans and Hillary Clinton for the Democrats, there was no longer a mainstream candidate calling for extreme overhaul of foreign policy, ending the war on drugs, or looking for solutions outside of party lines. That's when I decided to look into third parties.
Libertarians are fiscally conservative, and socially they really don't give a damn as long as you don't force your social whatever it is on anybody else. Deporting 11 million illegal immigrants, I think, is a crazy notion. I think that we should embrace immigration. Libertarians are non-interventionists. The fact that we militarily intervene in other countries' affairs I think has the unintended consequence of making things less safe in the world. We need to end the drug war.
Gary Johnson was the only real option, though he was definitely extreme. He was the only candidate representing any of my values who had any sort of a chance.
If you were elected about Aleppo. About Aleppo. And what is Aleppo?
Oh well.
Right now,
so then the unimaginable happened. Donald Trump won. Nobody knew what to expect. Donald Trump has been a national embarrassment on many levels and a horrible communicator.
We can't. I would never do that. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with.
Aside from his rhetoric, he hasn't been too much different from any other president before him. He has continued our arms dealings with Saudi Arabia, just as Barack Obama and George Bush did. He's done almost nothing to curb our foreign policy of interventionism, and he's extended the provisions of unconstitutional overreach.
We must defeat the most dangerous president in the history.
The contenders for the Democratic nomination came out in full force. I was looking extensively for an alternative to Trump, but just replacing him would not be enough. We needed someone who would actually bring about positive change. None of the candidates were hitting home for me. They all had varying degrees of ideas for typical Democratic programs, some more extreme than others, but I didn't hear any stress of importance on foreign policy, ending the drug war, or protecting our constitutional rights. That was until I heard of one candidate in particular.
Who will be debating tonight in Miami are going to say and stand for the things that Ron Paul is saying.
Well, unfortunately, I only know of one, and that's Tulsi Gabbard.
I enlisted in the Army National Guard after the al-Qaeda terror attacks on 9/11, so I could go after those who had attacked us on that day. I still serve as a major, served over 16 years, deployed twice to the Middle East, and in Congress serve on the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committees for over 6 years. I know the importance of our national security, as well as the terribly high cost of war. And for too long, our leaders have failed us, taking us from one regime change war to the next, leading us into a new Cold War and arms race, costing us trillions of our hard-earned taxpayer dollars.
To me, she was like a mirror image of Rand Paul. Though she had extremely liberal fiscal policies, she was not afraid to distance herself from the rest of her party on foreign policy and a number of other issues.
That it is women who control their own bodies, not politicians.
I support codifying Roe v. Wade while making sure that during the third trimester, abortion is not an option unless the life or severe health consequences of a woman are at risk.
When somebody comes across the border, not to criminalize desperation.
You know, the reality is that we do not have a nation if we don't have borders.
I know that in some respects you have a limited government streak. And there are a lot of libertarians who, in terms of foreign policy, you're the only candidate that has resonated with them there.
Now, before you go off and assume, hey, she's just another Democrat in favor of unlimited spending with no regard for where that money comes from or how we pay for things, let me just say that's not the case.
Much like Rand Paul had trouble getting his message out to mainstream Republicans, Tulsi had the same problem getting hers out to mainstream Democrats. She relied heavily on independent journalists and even right-wing news outlets.
Of all the people polling over 1%, you're the only one who so far has come and sat down to talk.
This is a problem that we're seeing in our political culture today, is where people are increasingly unwilling, our leaders are increasingly unwilling to sit down with those who may be, quote unquote, on the other team.
Me and the people that are doing the online thing, it's like we see this all the time. If you step out of anything that sort of the modern left doesn't want you to do, you're automatically the bad guy. But then when I saw it going after you, I was like, see, they just do this to everybody.
Why would the U.S. government ever side with the Saudi kingdom of all countries against our citizens?
She's sane, a vet with a libertarian bent, one that's not to the left of the Dems, but to the right of the Dems. So
and just as Rand was vilified by his own party, Tulsi was a constant victim of attacks from establishment figures and fellow candidates.
I think that it's unfortunate that we have someone on the stage who is attempting to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, who during the Obama administration spent 4 years full-time on Fox News criticizing President Obama.
She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of, sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far.
I just think that she could be a useful idiot the way Trump is a useful idiot to the Russians. Yeah.
And if your question is about experience, let's also talk about judgment. One of the foreign leaders you mentioned meeting was Bashar al-Assad. I have, in my experience, such as it is, whether you think it counts or not, since it wasn't accumulated in Washington, enough judgment that I would not have sat down with a murderous dictator like that.
In fact, the closer I looked at the two candidates, I realized that when it came to foreign policy, there were no two politicians in Washington more identical.
I've introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, legislation that would stop our government from using taxpayer dollars to directly or indirectly support groups who are allied with and supporting terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in their war to overthrow the Syrian government.
And how'd that go? Did that pass? No.
Yeah, very few people have co-sponsored it.
Now, why is that? Why wouldn't
the lone introducer and co-sponsor in the Senate? Can you guess who that is?
Mike Lee?
Rand Paul.
Oh, okay.
Rand Paul.
But their similarities go beyond simply wanting to make a change in our foreign policy. Many specific details of how we should do so are strikingly similar, and much of their domestic policy of demanding the federal government's overreach of power to be held in check and reforming our criminal justice system are amazingly paralleled.
What's your response?
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system.
that is disproportionately negatively impacting black and brown people all across this country today.
Drug use is about equal between white and black, but our prisons, 3 out of 4 people in prison are black or brown.
As your president, I'll end the failed war on drugs that's ruined so many people's lives, that's overcrowded our prisons and torn families apart.
Our prisons are full of black and brown kids, so I want to end the war on drugs because it's wrong for everybody, but particularly because poor people are caught up in this and their lives are ruined by it.
I'll crack down on the overreaching intelligence agencies and big tech monopolies who are taking away our civil liberties in the name of national security and corporate greed, and protect our constitutional right to privacy and free speech.
And as president, on day one, I will immediately end this unconstitutional surveillance.
The point here is that it is illegal to spy on Americans without a warrant.
How are you supposed to know, Megan?
Use the Fourth
What are you supposed
Amendment.
to? How are you supposed
Use
to?
the Fourth
No, I'll tell you how you
get a warrant.
Let me tell you something.
Get
you go
a judge to sign
when
a warrant.
Senator.
Go ahead, wait, Governor Christie, make your point.
So if you have somebody that has raised some level of suspicion, then as a law enforcement officer or agency, we're protected by our Constitution in this way,
right,
where you have to do the tough work of building your evidence and actually getting a warrant to do this.
Here's the problem, Governor. You fundamentally misunderstand the Bill of Rights. Every time you did a case, you got a warrant from a judge. I'm talking about searches without warrants, indiscriminately of all Americans' records, and that's what I fought to end.
Our national debt is something that we all need to take seriously. And the fact is, both parties have been reckless in allowing our debt to reach what it is now.
We borrow $1 million a minute. And whose fault is it? Well, frankly, it's both parties' fault.
And the American people still don't have access to the truth about Saudi Arabia and who helped al-Qaeda carry out these deadly attacks.
The question is, should we sell arms to Saudi Arabia, a country that many suspect was involved in 9/11?
For so long, leaders in our government have said, well, Saudi Arabia is our great ally. They're a partner in counterterrorism, turning a blind eye or completely walking away from the reality that Saudi Arabia, time and again, has proven to be the opposite.
Saudi Arabia is not a reliable ally. Saudi Arabia should not get these weapons.
Yes. They're undermining our national security interests. They are the #1 exporter of this Wahhabi extremist ideology.
Yes. A country that imprisons the victims of rape because it's apparently or presumably the fault of the woman who is raped in Saudi Arabia.
The fertile recruiting ground for terrorists like al-Qaeda and ISIS around the world.
A country that many suspect gave weapons to ISIS, the people we're fighting.
They're directly providing arms and assistance to al-Qaeda in places like Yemen and in Syria.
Currently, there is a blockade of Yemen. 17 million people risk starvation. We should not be supporting this effort.
Hillary Clinton, throughout her career, has espoused, advocated, and championed a very interventionist foreign policy, pushing for regime change wars, toppling dictators in other countries, being the world's police, using draconian sanctions to accomplish these things, and they have proven to be incredibly destructive.
Interestingly, many of the hawks in my party line right up with President Obama. Think about the big issues we've had in the last couple years. The war that Hillary prominently promoted in Libya. Many of the hawks in my party were right there with her.
The same things that are being said about Assad right now were said about Gaddafi. They were said about Saddam Hussein by those who were advocating for the U.S. to go in and intervene, to overthrow those regimes and those dictators. The fact is that if that happens here in Syria, as U.S. leaders and others are advocating for, we will end up with a situation far worse than we're seeing today.
Regime change hasn't won. Toppling secular dictators in the Middle East has only led to chaos and the rise of radical Islam.
We'll end up in a situation with far greater human suffering, with far greater persecution of religious minorities and Christians in Syria, and our enemy will be far stronger. They will take over the entire country of Syria. They will have greater weapons and capabilities and present a greater threat not only to the people in the region, but to the world.
There are still people, the majority on the stage, They want to topple Assad, and then there'll be chaos, and I think ISIS will then be in charge of Syria.
I don't want the U.S. government to provide weapons to al-Qaeda, to Islamic extremists, to our enemy. I think it's a very simple concept in my mind that you can't defeat your enemy if you're arming them and helping them at the same time. It makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Have you told this? I think if we want to defeat terrorism, I think if we truly are sincere about defeating terrorism, we need to quit arming the allies of ISIS.
I think it's important for the American people to understand exactly what those positions mean. People are calling them different things, a no-fly zone or a safe zone, but for those who are pushing for this, again, that puts us into a direct head-to-head conflict with a sovereign government, the government of Syria, and with Russia and their allies, and will also require a very large amount of ground troops on the ground to enforce this. There are a slew of other issues with this, and why I think a no-fly zone would be a terrible mistake.
My goodness, what we want in a leader is someone with judgment, not someone who is so reckless as to stand on the stage and say, yes, I'm jumping up and down. I'm going to shoot down Russian planes. Russia already flies in that airspace. It may not be something we're in love with the fact that they're there, but they were invited by Iraq and by Syria to fly in that airspace. And so if we announce that we're going to have a no-fly zone, and others have said this, Hillary Clinton's also for it, it is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for World War III.
What you've just pointed out is that you would lack the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends to ensure the peace and national security of our nation.
I think this goes back to essentially what we've been saying for the last 2 or 3 questions. Carly Fiorina also said, we're not going to talk with Putin. Well, think if Reagan had said that during the Cold War. We continued to talk with the Russians throughout the Cold War, which is much more significant than where we are now. Should we continue to talk with Iran? Yes.
I take the example of those leaders who have come before us, leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev, like Roosevelt, who met with Stalin,
like Donald Trump,
Reagan, who met and worked with Gorbachev. These issues of national security are incredibly important.
The same goes with China. I don't think we need to be rash. I don't think we need to be reckless. And I think we need to leave lines of communication open.
I will meet with and do what is necessary to make sure that no more of our brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly sent into harm's way fighting regime change wars that undermine our national security. I'll bring real leadership and experience to the White House.
Often we talk about whether we should be engaged in the world or disengaged in the world. And I think this is an example of some who want to isolate us, actually, and not be engaged. We do need to be engaged with Russia. It doesn't mean we give them a free pass or China a free pass, but to be engaged means to continue to talk. We did throughout the Cold War, and it'd be a big mistake not to do it.
We need to get back into the Iran nuclear agreement, and we need to negotiate how we can improve it. It was an imperfect deal. There are issues like their missile development that needs to be addressed. We can do both simultaneously to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon and preventing us from going to war.
Time is up, and this is a very quick.
Should we cut up the agreement immediately? That's absurd. Wouldn't you want to know if they've complied? Now, I'm going to vote against the agreement because I don't think there's significant leverage, but it doesn't mean that I would immediately not look at the agreement and cut it up without looking to see whether Iran is complying.
Is that what you will tell the parents of those 2 soldiers who were just killed in Afghanistan? Well, we just have to be engaged. As a soldier, I will tell you that answer is unacceptable.
You tell
Turkey,
their parents.
the green light.
You tell their parents why they're there.
But isn't that true?
You tell their parents why they're there.
Isn't it true that Turkey?
We have to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. We are in a place in Afghanistan where we have lost so many lives. We've spent so much money that's coming out of every one of our pockets, money that should be going into communities here at home, meeting the needs of the people here at home. We are no better off in Afghanistan today than we were when this war began.
We've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. The same people complaining about this. The Cheneys, Lindsey Graham, you know what they say about Afghanistan? It would be precipitous to leave. We've been there 19 years. There's no mission, and I'm not sending one more kid.
But there's more questions. Breaking our word.
And I am calling out what I have seen as a corruptive influence in our party that's taken it away from being the party of the people that it needs to be.
And I think in the Republican Party, the biggest mistake we've made in the last several decades is we haven't gone into the African American community, into the NAACP, and say, you know what? we are concerned about what's going on in your cities, and we have plans. They may be different than the Democrats, but we do have plans, and we do want to help. And I think beginning that conversation...
Obviously, they disagree strongly on taxes, social programs, and environmental issues. But when I vote for president, I look for someone who has the values of the Constitution at heart, someone who wants to protect our civil liberties from threats both foreign and domestic, and someone who realizes that there are more ways of being involved in the world than simply bombing other countries. I don't strictly agree 100% with either of them. I thought Rand Paul's ideas of privatizing federal lands and giving tax breaks to the rich while trying to balance the budget were absurd. I'm skeptical of some of Tulsi's healthcare and education plans and find her environmental plans to be a bit unrealistic and might even categorize them as wishful thinking. But the bottom line is this. Both Rand and Tulsi were on a very specific mission: to reform their own political parties to represent the people, end the federal government's unconstitutional abuse, and bring about a radical change in foreign policy. I've had the honor of meeting Tulsi here in New Hampshire and volunteering on her campaign. I think she is a candidate who has a chance to heal our partisan divides and move forward with a government that is truly of, by, and for the people.
And she's somebody that I root for because she's sending out a message there, but I think she will face a tough haul. Just think how much agreement the Republicans are with the Democrats. The Democrats nor the Republicans are saying, you know, we really need to do something about the Federal Reserve. And neither side really cares about the deficit. And I don't think either side, even though Trump mentions it, we need to bring our troops home. And Tulsi mentions those things, and I think she's a very valuable candidate.